My hands were shaking when I walked out of that room. Not from fatigue. I had been on call for 19 consecutive hours, and I was not trembling from exhaustion. I was trembling because of what I had just seen on a 15-year-old boy's face 2 minutes after his heart stopped. His expression, the specific configuration of his features. In 31 years of emergency medicine, I had watched hundreds of people die, and I had learned, clinically, precisely, what a human face does in those final seconds. The muscles release in a specific sequence. The jaw softens. The brow falls. It follows a pattern as predictable as any other biological process. What I saw on Carlo Acutis' face followed no pattern I had ever documented. I pressed my back against the corridor wall outside room 14 at the San Gerardo Hospital in Monza, and I stood there for 4 minutes. I know it was 4 minutes because I checked my watch when I came out and again when I finally moved, and I could not explain what I had seen. And there was something else I could not explain. The sealed envelope he had pressed into my hand 3 days earlier, with a single instruction whispered in a voice already fading from the leukemia. He told me not to open it until I was standing in a specific place. A place he named. A place I had never been. That was October 12th, 2006. I am telling you this now because I can no longer justify staying silent. My name is Dr. Marcos Santilli. I served as attending physician in the oncology and emergency units at San Gerardo Hospital in Monza for 11 years, and before that I completed my residency at the University of Pavia with a specialization in pediatric critical care. I have worked in clinical medicine for 31 years. I am not a mystic. I was raised nominally Catholic, which in practical terms meant I attended Mass at Christmas and Easter, believed vaguely in something I could not define, and placed my real trust in measurements, in peer-reviewed literature, in the reproducibility of observed results. I was the kind of doctor who wrote peaceful passing in charts and meant nothing spiritual by it. Carlo Acutis changed that, but not the way you might imagine, not gently, not in a single revelatory moment. He changed it the way a fracture changes a bone, under pressure, with a sound, and permanently. For 17 years I kept what I witnessed inside this hospital within the professional walls of my own memory. I gave one statement to the diocesan investigators in 2009, and I said what I could verify. I left out the rest. I left out the sealed envelope. I left out what he told me about the light. And I left out what I found 14 years later, in a hospital in another country, in the exact room he had described to me in October 2006. 3 things I have never said publicly until today. 3 questions I need you to hold. First, what did I see on Carlo Acutis' face in the 2 minutes after clinical death? Second, what was written inside that sealed envelope, and why did it take me 14 years to be standing in the right place to open it? Third, and this is the one that still keeps me awake, how did a 15-year-old boy dying of fulminant leukemia know the name of a doctor he had never met, in a city he had never visited, and a date that was still 14 years away? I have not answered these 3 questions to my own complete satisfaction, but I have evidence, documented, dated, corroborated evidence. And today I am going to lay every piece of it down. The call came on the morning of October 3rd, 2006. I had just finished a 12-hour night shift reviewing post-operative cases in the cardiac unit when the department coordinator reached me in the break room. New admission to oncology. Pediatric, 15 years old, transferred from a clinic in Monza following a diagnosis of acute promyelocytic leukemia, M3 subtype, confirmed by bone marrow biopsy 4 days earlier. White blood cell count at admission, 87,400 per microliter, nearly 9 times the upper threshold of normal. The bleeding indices were already critical. Prothrombin time 31 seconds against a reference of 11 to 13. The hematology team was already on the case, but protocol required a general attending physician assigned to coordinate the full care picture. That assignment landed on me. I remember walking down the corridor toward room 14 with the chart in my hand, doing the arithmetic I had done too many times before with M3 leukemia presenting at this stage of disseminated intravascular coagulopathy. The numbers were not favorable. In 2006, the treatment protocols using all-trans retinoic acid combined with arsenic trioxide had improved 5-year survival rates to somewhere between 63 and 71% in adults. But in pediatric cases presenting with coagulopathy this advanced, The initial mortality window in the first 72 hours was documented at between 18 and 24% in the literature I knew at the time. I pushed open the door to room 14, expecting what I always found in these cases: a frightened child, frightened parents, the particular silence of a family that had just received news it cannot absorb. Carlo was sitting up in the bed reading a book, a theological text. I could see the cover, something about the church fathers. His mother, Antonia, was in the chair beside him, and his father, Andrea, stood near the window. But what I noticed first, before I introduced myself, before I reviewed the chart with them, was the boy's face. He looked at me when I came through the door, and he smiled. A specific kind of smile. Not the performed cheerfulness I sometimes see in patients who are trying to protect their family. Not the medicated serenity of someone on anxiolytics. Something else. I registered it clinically as anomalous affect for a patient in acute crisis. I wrote that phrase in my notes that evening. Anomalous affect. Non-distressed, non-medicated. I introduced myself. We reviewed the treatment plan. He asked me 2 questions about the mechanism of atra therapy. Detailed, specific questions that would have been reasonable from a medical student, not a 15-year-old. His mother told me later he had spent the previous night reading everything he could find about M3 leukemia on the internet. Of course he had. I learned quickly that Carlo Acutis and the internet had an unusual relationship. He had spent the previous 2 years building what he described to me as a catalog of Eucharistic miracles. A website, he said. 160 documented cases from around the world, each one researched, sourced, displayed. He said it matter-of-factly, the way another teenager might mention a football team he followed. On my 3rd visit, October 6th, he asked if I had a moment to sit down. I sat in the chair his mother had vacated. The afternoon light was coming through the half-open blind in horizontal lines across the floor. His blood pressure that morning had been 88/54, and we had adjusted his fluid management accordingly. He was weaker than he appeared. He reached under the pillow and pulled out an envelope, plain white, sealed with clear tape across the flap, folded once lengthwise. He held it out to me, and when I reached for it, he held it a moment longer than necessary, so that I was looking directly at him. "Don't open this until you're in Pamplona," he said. "You'll know when." I stared at him. He let go of the envelope. I had no connection to Pamplona. I had driven through northern Spain once in 1998 on a road trip with a colleague, but I had never worked there, had no family there, no professional contacts there. It meant nothing to me. I told him that, gently. I said I wasn't sure I would ever have reason to go to Pamplona. He nodded as though I had said something he already knew and expected. "You will," he said, "and there will be someone there who needs you to have read it." I folded the envelope and put it in the inner pocket of my white coat. I told myself I would ask him more about it when he was stronger. I told myself there was probably a reasonable explanation. Perhaps he was confused about the geography. Perhaps he meant somewhere else. I documented the interaction in my personal notes, but not in the official chart. It didn't belong in the chart. I didn't know where it belonged. What I could not dismiss, even then, was the specificity. He didn't say somewhere in Spain. He said Pamplona. He didn't say someone. He said someone there who needs you to have read it. Specific. Directed. From a boy with a white blood cell count that had reached 91,200 per microliter by that afternoon. I kept the envelope, and I want you to understand something about what I did with it over the next several days. I nearly opened it. 3 times. I held it up to a light source in my office on the evening of October 7th, and I could make out the shape of handwriting through the paper, but I could not read it. The paper was thicker than standard. I put it back in my coat pocket. Something, I cannot give you a clinical name for this, something told me to respect the instruction. I don't use that kind of language easily. I'm a physician. But that is what happened. The envelope traveled with me every day from October 6th until the morning of October 12th. It was in my coat pocket when I walked into room 14 for the last time. The deterioration came faster than the models predicted. By October 9th, Carlo's platelet count had dropped to 8,000 per microliter. The threshold for spontaneous intracranial bleeding is typically set at 10,000, and our hematology team had already begun emergency platelet transfusions. His temperature that morning was 38.7 degrees Celsius, indicating a systemic inflammatory response that complicated the ATRA protocol. I convened a case conference with Dr. Rinaldi from hematology and Dr. Fossati from the pediatric intensive care unit. We adjusted the treatment. We were doing everything the evidence supported. By October 11th, his oxygen saturation was holding at 94% on 2 liters of supplemental oxygen, and the platelet count had responded partially to transfusion, coming back to 23,000. There was a window, a narrow one, but real, where the numbers moved in the right direction. I wrote in my notes that evening, stabilization tentative, 24-hour picture cautiously improved. I remember the specific word I chose. Cautiously. He was not afraid. I want to say that plainly because it matters to what comes next. I have watched many patients in terminal trajectories, and fear presents in measurable ways. Elevated cortisol metabolites, specific patterns of agitation, insomnia, a particular relationship with sound and light. Carlo showed none of these markers. His mother told me he was continuing to pray the rosary each morning. He had asked for daily reception of the Eucharist, which the hospital chaplain provided. He told me once, during a brief lucid period on the morning of the 11th when his pain was better controlled, "The Eucharist is my highway to heaven. Doctor, I'm not worried about the destination." He said it conversationally, like a man who had already consulted the map and confirmed the route. I wrote it in my personal notes verbatim. The intracranial hemorrhage began in the early hours of October 12th. The nursing team detected a sudden change in his level of consciousness at 2:17 a.m. The CT scan at 2:44 a.m. confirmed a large left hemisphere hemorrhage. By 3:10 a.m., the neurosurgery team had reviewed the imaging and determined that intervention was not viable given the systemic coagulopathy. By 6 a.m., he had been transferred to intensive care. By 9:30 a.m., he was unresponsive. I was called to the room at 10:40 a.m. His family was present: Antonia, Andrea, and an aunt whose name I did not record. The chaplain had administered the anointing of the sick earlier that morning. The room was quiet in a way that hospital rooms are only in those final passages, not silent, because the machines continued, but containing a specific quality of silence beneath the sounds. I performed my clinical assessment. Pupils fixed and dilated at 11:02 a.m. Glasgow Coma Scale, 3, the minimum. Respiratory effort absent, ventilator sustaining. I documented everything with precision because precision is what I have when everything else fails. At 11:18 a.m., I confirmed cardiac cessation. I called the time of death. And then I stayed in the room for 2 more minutes before I wrote anything further because of what I saw. His face. The muscles of the human face relax at death in a documented sequence. The orbicularis oculi releases first, the muscles around the eye, followed by the frontalis, the zygomatic, the depressor angulioris. The jaw drops slightly. The overall effect, which I have observed in hundreds of cases, produces a specific expression that varies between individuals in degree but follows the same general morphological pattern, a relaxed, emptied appearance. The clinical literature describes it as an expression of repose. Neutral, absent. Carlo Acutis' face, in the 2 minutes following clinical death, did not do this. His expression, and I am choosing my words with the same precision I use in a clinical report, his expression was of someone who had just recognized something. Eyes closed, but the muscles around them arranged in a way that I have since reviewed in every reference text I own, and I cannot find a classification for it. The zygomatic major, the muscle that pulls the corners of the mouth upward, was contracted, mildly, measurably. The brow was slightly elevated, not furrowed, elevated, as it is in the expression taxonomy called positive surprise. And the overall configuration, held for approximately 90 seconds after confirmed cardiac cessation, before gradually releasing into the standard relaxation pattern. The overall configuration was unmistakably, specifically, the expression of recognition, of arrival. I stood at the foot of his bed and I looked at this, and I felt my clinical vocabulary fail me for the first time in 31 years of practice. I walked out of the room. I pressed my back against the corridor wall. I stood there for 4 minutes. And then I did something I had never done before and have done only once since. I went to my office, I locked the door, and I prayed. I did not know how to pray properly. I said something out loud that I am not going to repeat because it was private and unformed and honest in a way that I had not allowed myself to be since medical school. I sat there for 11 minutes. Then I splashed water on my face, I straightened my coat, I went back to the corridor, and I completed my documentation. I did not write about the expression in the official chart. I wrote it in my personal notes, with a timestamp, in detail. 7 paragraphs. I still have those notes. The envelope was still in my coat pocket. If that testimony has stirred something in you, if you feel something of what I felt standing in that corridor, I want to give you something before I continue. I prepared a novena to Carlo Acutis, completely free, 9 days of prayer inspired by his devotion, so that you can bring whatever you are carrying to him. It is in the description, the first link, right below this video. Download it today, pray it for whoever is on your heart. But before I tell you what the medical investigation revealed in the days that followed, and what another physician found that I could not explain away, I have to take you back inside that room. The formal review of Carlo Acutis' death began 2 days later, on October 14th, when I was contacted by Dr. Agata Farini from the hospital's clinical review board. Standard procedure for a pediatric death, a structured retrospective analysis of the care timeline. I participated fully. I submitted my documentation. Nothing in the review process generated clinical concern. The treatment had been evidence-based and appropriately adjusted as the picture evolved. The cause of death was confirmed as intracranial hemorrhage secondary to acute promyelocytic leukemia with disseminated intravascular coagulopathy. Precise and accurate. But the review process introduced me to something I had not factored into my own thinking. Dr. Farini mentioned, during our second meeting on October 17th, that the nursing team who had been present during the final hours had submitted an addendum to the shift notes. Standard post-death documentation. She showed it to me across the table. The addendum, written by the overnight charge nurse, a woman with 22 years of experience named Claudia Minetti, described a temperature reading taken as part of the final vital signs check at 11:04 a.m., 14 minutes before I confirmed cardiac cessation. The reading was 36.1 degrees Celsius. The instrument was a tympanic thermometer, unit T47, calibrated on October 9th as part of the ward's bi-weekly equipment check. 36.1 degrees Celsius. In a patient with confirmed absent respiratory effort and profound circulatory failure, in a room maintained at a standard hospital ambient temperature of 22 degrees Celsius at 11:04 in the morning. I looked at Dr. Farini. She looked at me. She said, with the measured tone of someone who has decided not to draw conclusions, that she was simply noting it as a data point for the record. Normal temperature range for a living body is 36.1 to 37.2 degrees Celsius. The reading was within that range. But the clinical picture at 11:04 a.m. did not support a core body temperature of 36.1 degrees. I went back to the ward and I found Nurse Minetti on her shift. I asked her about the reading. She confirmed it. She had in fact retaken it. She told me she had retaken it because she assumed the instrument was malfunctioning. She retook it with a second instrument, unit T52, also calibrated in the October 9th service check. Second reading, 36.0 degrees. She recorded both readings in the addendum. 2 thermometers, 2 readings, both within the normal range for a living body. I requested the calibration records for both units. I received them the following morning. A 2-page service log from the Biomedical Engineering Department, signed and dated, showing T47 and T52 both tested on October 9th and reading within 0.1 degrees of a standard reference on that date. The instruments were not malfunctioning. I now had a second, worse problem. If the instruments were accurate, then the temperature data I was looking at was incompatible with the clinical picture. A patient at 11:04 a.m. in the physiological state Carlo Acutis was in, absent spontaneous respiration, absent purposeful movement, absent response to stimuli, with the hemorrhage pattern confirmed on the morning CT scan, should have already been trending toward the ambient temperature of the room. Even accounting for the residual heat of the ventilator circuit, the numbers did not fit. I consulted Dr. Fossati privately, without referencing the case. I described the clinical picture in generic terms and asked him what temperature values he would expect to see. He said, "In that presentation, you might see 34, 33 if they've been on cooling protocols. 36.1 suggests either the instrument is off or you're looking at someone who isn't as far gone as the clinical picture suggests." The instruments were not off. I went home that night and I opened the thermodynamics chapter of a physiology reference text I had not touched since residency. The Newton's law of cooling applied to human body temperature predicts a drop of approximately 0.8 to 1.5 degrees Celsius per hour in a standard hospital environment, beginning at the point of circulatory failure. The readings documented by Nurse Minetti, if taken at approximately 11:04, should have reflected a body that had been in circulatory decline for at minimum 3 hours. The hemorrhage onset was documented at 2:17 a.m., and circulatory support had been marginal for most of that period. By the models, the core temperature at 11:04 should have been somewhere between 33.8 and 35.2 degrees Celsius. It was 36.1. I sat with that number for a long time, and then the problem became worse still. Because I remembered that I had been in the room with Carlo Acutis between 10:45 and 11:20 a.m. on the day he died, I had been close to him. I had performed the physical assessment, and I had not used a thermometer during my examination. My assessment at that point was focused on neurological status, not temperature. But I had placed my hand on his forearm when I reached across to check the IV line at approximately 11:10 a.m. He had been warm. I had registered it at the time and filed it as unremarkable, a body on a ventilator in a heated room. Normal. But now, with the temperature data in front of me, I went back to that tactile memory, and I examined it with the same attention I was giving the instrument readings. The warmth I had felt was not the specific warmth of residual ventilator heat at the periphery. It was the warmth of a functioning body. And this is where I could no longer frame it as a measurement anomaly. Because I had 29 years of clinical experience placing my hands on patients in every stage of illness and death. And what I had felt was not what I expected to feel on a patient whose neurological picture had been what Carlo's picture was at 11:10 a.m. I had 3 anomalies now: the expression at death, the temperature readings, the tactile finding. Each explainable separately within some margin. Together, they were generating a question I did not know how to answer. I put the sealed envelope on my desk that night, and I stared at it for a long time. But what happened the next morning introduced a 4th element, an element that did not come from my own observations at all, and that, in some ways, was the most disorienting thing of all. On the morning of October 18th, 6 days after Carlo's death, I received a phone call from a colleague I had not spoken to in 8 months. Dr. Pietro Vasari, not his real name, he has asked me to use an alias, was a neurologist on the staff at San Gerardo who had been called in as a consult on October 11th to review Carlo's case from a neurological standpoint. He had spent approximately 40 minutes in room 14 on that date. He had reviewed the CT imaging. He had contributed a neurological note to the chart that I had read and found technically thorough and straightforward. He called me at 7:43 a.m. and said, "Santelli, I need to tell you something about the boy from room 14. We met for coffee at a place near the hospital at 8:15. He came in holding a folded piece of paper, and he set it on the table face down without opening it. He looked uncomfortable, and I want to be precise about that description because Pietro Vasari was one of the least emotionally demonstrative physicians I have known, a man who reviewed brain death criteria with the same tone he would use to discuss parking logistics. He told me that on October 11th, during his 40-minute evaluation in room 14, something had occurred that he had not included in his clinical note. He had been sitting at the bedside completing his neurological assessment. Carlo had been lucid at that point. The hemorrhage did not begin until the following day. Pietro had asked him several standard orientation questions as part of the mental status exam, and Carlo had answered all of them correctly. And then, at the end of the examination, Carlo had said something to him. Pietro unfolded the piece of paper. It was a standard hospital notepad sheet with the date, October 11th, 2006, written in the upper right corner. Below it, in Pietro's handwriting, was a brief notation, a name, a date, and a place. The name was not mine. It was the name of Pietro's daughter, who was 7 years old at the time. The date was August 14th, 2009. The place was the emergency room of the Ospedale Civil di Brescia. Carlo had told Pietro Vasari on October 11th, 2006, that his 7-year-old daughter would be brought to the Ospedale Civil di Brescia Emergency Department on August 14th, 2009. Pietro could hear me processing this. He kept his voice even. He had clearly rehearsed this part, and that she would be fine. I looked at the piece of paper for a long time. Did it happen? I asked. He picked up his coffee cup and set it down again without drinking. She was hit by a bicycle on the afternoon of August 14th, 2009, he said. Concussion, lacerated right forearm, 2 broken fingers on the left hand. The ambulance took her to the Ospedale Civil di Brescia. He paused. She was discharged the same evening. She was fine. I sat there. Pietro Vasari had carried that piece of paper in his wallet for 2 years without telling anyone. He told me he had almost called me when it happened, in August 2009, but had not been able to find language for it. He was a neurologist. He did not have language for it. He was bringing it to me now, in October 2009, because the diocesan investigation had been announced, and he thought it was possible that what he knew might be relevant, and he could not hold it any longer alone. I asked him whether he had made any note, on any date between October 2006 and August 2009, that would corroborate that he had written this down before the event rather than after. He pulled out his phone. He had sent himself an email, a 2-line email with no subject line, sent from his hospital account to his personal account on October 12, 2006, the day Carlo died. The timestamp read 9:47 p.m. The text, *room 14. He said August 14th, 2009. Brescia emergency. Giulio will be fine. Giulio was his daughter's name. The email had been sent 11 months and 2 days before the event it described. I went back to my office and I sat down heavily in my chair and I picked up the sealed envelope from my desk drawer where I had put it the night before. I turned it over in my hands. I thought about the specificity of what Pietro had just shown me. A name, a date, a place 11 months in advance, in an email with a verifiable timestamp. And I thought about the instruction Carlo had given me. Pamplona. You'll know when. I did not know when. Not yet. But I was beginning to understand what kind of information might be inside that envelope. I put it back in the drawer. I was not ready. And more than that, I was not in Pamplona. The question that was pressing on me now was a different one entirely. I needed to understand who this boy had been. Not as a patient, not as a clinical case, but as a person, because the data I was accumulating was beginning to form a shape that my medical education gave me no framework to interpret, and the only responsible thing I could do was gather more information before I reached any conclusion. That investigation was about to change everything I thought I knew about what I had witnessed. I spent the better part of 2007 gathering information about Carlo Acutis that was not available in any clinical record. The first source was Antonia Salzano, Carlo's mother, whom I contacted by letter in January 2007. She agreed to meet me. We spoke for 3 hours at a cafe in Milan on February 8th of that year. I came with a list of clinical questions. I told her I was completing a comprehensive case review, but what she gave me was something far more layered than case history. She told me about the Eucharistic Miracles website. Carlo had spent, she estimated, between 1 and 3 hours per day for approximately 2 years building and maintaining it, cataloging documented cases from around the world where the scientific examination of Eucharistic phenomena had produced findings that the investigators themselves described as inexplicable. He had corresponded with researchers in multiple countries. He had organized the information into a physical exhibition as well, panels, photographs, documentation, that had traveled to parishes in Italy and beyond. At the time of his death in October 2006, the catalog contained 160 documented cases. The website was still live. She told me something else. Something she said she had not shared with many people outside the family. In the weeks before Carlo's diagnosis, in September 2006, before anyone knew about the leukemia, he had told her that he was not going to be here for very long. She had assumed he meant something philosophical, the way adolescents sometimes speak, but he said it matter-of-factly, at the kitchen table, over dinner. He said, "Mama, I don't have much time left here. But everything I've done, the website, the exhibition, it can keep going without me." She had told him not to speak like that. He had nodded and smiled and eaten his pasta. 3 weeks later, he was diagnosed with M3 leukemia. She also told me, and this is the detail that connected directly to what Pietro Vasari had shown me, that Carlo had made several other specific statements to people in the weeks before his diagnosis and during his hospitalization. She did not have details of all of them, but she knew he had spoken to the hospital chaplain about something specific on October 9th, 3 days before his death, and that the chaplain had been visibly shaken by the conversation. She did not know what was said. The chaplain had kept it in pastoral confidence. I wrote down every word Antonia said, and I transcribed it that evening. And then I pulled up the Eucharistic Miracles website. I spent 4 hours going through the documentation Carlo had assembled. I want to be precise about what I found, because precision is what I owe you. The site was not a collection of unverified claims or devotional anecdotes. Each case entry included the location, the date, the diocesan or scientific body that had investigated it, and where available, the specific findings of that investigation. Several entries cited laboratory analyses by teams with no religious affiliation. The Lanciano case, the oldest, dating to the 8th century, cited histological analyses conducted in 1970 to 71 by Dr. Odoardo Linoli, a professor of anatomy and pathological histology, who found the sample to be human cardiac muscle tissue, blood type AB, with preservation characteristics consistent across every specimen. Case by case, Carlo had built a body of evidence. I sat there at my desk at 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday in February 2007 reading the work of a 15-year-old boy who had understood, with complete clarity, that the most honest response to mystery was not dismissal and not credulity. It was investigation, documentation, a catalog, carefully maintained, that said, "Here is what was found. Make of it what you will." I thought about the sealed envelope in my desk drawer. I thought about Pamplona. And I thought about something Antonia had said in passing, almost at the end of our conversation, something I had not asked about, something she offered as a kind of afterthought. She said Carlo had mentioned, during his second week in the hospital, that there was a doctor at San Gerardo who would eventually understand something important. She said he had described this doctor as skeptical, but the good kind of skeptical. She said he had used a phrase she remembered precisely because it had seemed so particular. He said this doctor would need the envelope to make sense of what they see. She did not know the doctor was me. I asked her how she knew I was the one he meant. She looked at me across the table and she said, "Because you're the only doctor who came looking." I did not sleep that night. If you downloaded the novena I mentioned earlier, the free one in the description, the first link below this video, you already understand why I kept going back to it. And if you haven't found it yet, it's still there, waiting for you. 9 days of prayer to carry what you're feeling right now. But what I uncovered in the 2 weeks that followed this conversation with Antonia reached even deeper than her words, and it changed the way I understood every anomaly I had documented. What I discovered the following week changed even the way I prayed. The fourth thing I could not explain began in March 2007. I had been contacted by a journalist, I will not name her, who was writing a piece on Carlo Acutis for a Catholic publication. She had learned of my connection to the case through the diocesan investigation, and she reached out asking for comment. I declined to speak to her on the record, but in the course of our brief phone call, she mentioned something that stopped me. She mentioned the hospital chaplain. His name was Father Benedetto Casali. He had been the chaplain at San Gerardo from 2003 to 2009. He had administered the anointing of the sick to Carlo Acutis on the morning of October 12, 2006, hours before his death. And he had, according to the journalist, given a private written account of his experience to his diocese in late 2006, an account she had heard about but had not been able to access. I wrote to Father Casali in March 2007. He replied in April. He was willing to meet. We met at a church in Monza on the afternoon of April 19, 2007. He was a quiet man, 71 years old, with the specific stillness I have sometimes observed in people who have spent decades in pastoral proximity to suffering and have arrived at some interior resolution about it. He told me about October 9th, 3 days before Carlo died. He had gone to room 14 for a routine pastoral visit. Carlo had asked to speak with him privately. His parents had stepped out. The conversation had lasted approximately 25 minutes. Father Casali told me he was not breaking any confidence in sharing what he shared because Carlo had specifically said to him, toward the end of their conversation, "Tell the doctor about the light when the time is right. He'll need to hear it from someone else." There was no way Carlo could have known that Father Casali and I would ever speak. I had not been present during their conversation. There was no indication from my interactions with Carlo that he was arranging these pieces, that he was, in some sense, laying a trail. Father Casali told me that Carlo, on October 9th, had described what he expected the moment of his death to be like. He said it with the specificity of someone describing a journey they had taken before. He said there would be light. He said it would feel like recognition, his word, recognition, and that the expression on his face afterward would concern the doctors. He said, "The doctor will want to explain my face and won't be able to. Tell him the expression is real. Tell him what he sees is what is actually happening." Father Casali looked at me across the table in that church. "What did you see?" he asked. I told him. He nodded slowly, with the weight of someone for whom this confirmed something rather than surprised him. He told me one more thing. He told me that toward the end of their October 9th conversation, Carlo had mentioned the envelope. He had not described its contents. Father Casali did not know what was inside it, but Carlo had said to him, "I gave a sealed letter to the attending physician. He'll carry it for a long time before he's ready to open it. When he finally opens it, he should know. Everything in it is already verified." Already verified. I drove home from that meeting with my hands tied on the wheel. The minor mystery I had carried since October 6th, why Pamplona, specifically, was not resolved that afternoon. But a different question had been answered, and its resolution opened something deeper. I now had 4 separate witnesses, including myself, describing Carlo Acutis making specific, accurate statements about events and experiences he could not have accessed through any ordinary means. Each account was independently corroborated. Pietro's email timestamp, Antonia's precise recollection of the September dinner conversation, Father Casali's diocesan written account filed in late 2006 before any of us had spoken to each other. For independent data streams. Same source, same precision. What I could not answer, what the evidence would not let me rest on, was the most direct question. What had he actually known? What was the nature of the knowing? I had been trained to follow data to conclusions. The data was pointing somewhere I had not expected to go. But the envelope was still sealed, and I was still not in Pamplona. 12 years passed. I do not say that to suggest the questions faded, because they did not. I say it because the research I continued during those years, reading the full diocesan investigation reports as they became available, following the beatification cause, reviewing the first documented miracle, the healing of Mateus Castro, a Brazilian boy in Campo Grande, who in 2013 was cured of a congenital pancreatic defect through what the medical commission described as having no natural explanation. All of that material, accumulated across 12 years, only deepened the frame around what I had witnessed in October 2006. The beatification came in October 2020, a date I marked in my calendar the day it was announced. Pope Francis beatified Carlo Acutis on October 10th, 2020, in Assisi. I watched it on a screen in my apartment. I had the sealed envelope in my hand while I watched. And then came December 2019. The body of Carlo Acutis had been exhumed from the cemetery in Assisi in preparation for the beatification. The exhumation commission documented what they found. The body was substantially intact, 14 years after death. The documentation was formal, witnessed, part of the canonical record. I read the commission's report 3 times. 14 years. I thought about the temperature readings from October 12th, 2006. And then came the phone call in February 2020 that ended 12 years of waiting. A colleague, a cardiologist named Dr. Lourdes Ituri at the Clínica Universidad de Navarra in Pamplona, had been forwarded my name by a mutual contact in the Italian medical community. She was looking for a second consulting opinion on a pediatric case involving an unusual presentation of cardiac arrhythmia combined with an inflammatory picture. Would I be willing to travel to Pamplona for a case consultation? My hand went cold on the phone. Pamplona. I told her yes immediately. I told her I could be there within the week. She seemed slightly surprised at my speed. I did not explain. I booked a flight for February 14th, 2020. I packed the sealed envelope in the inner pocket of my travel jacket. I had not thought consciously about whether this was the time. I simply could not conceive of traveling to Pamplona without it. The consultation itself was scheduled for February 17th. I arrived at the Clínica Universidad de Navarra on the morning of that day and was brought to the cardiology unit on the 4th floor. Dr. Ituri met me in the corridor outside the consultation room. She was professional, organized, crisp in the way of someone running 3 things at once. She walked me through the case file while we moved through the corridor. And then she stopped at a door and said, "Before we go in, I should tell you that the patient's family asked specifically for a second opinion from Italy. I thought that was unusual, but they were very clear about it. The mother said she had been praying to Carlo Acutis." I stopped walking. "I'm sorry?" "The patient is 9 years old," Dr. Ituri said. "His mother has been doing a novena to Carlo Acutis for his recovery. She asked specifically for an Italian physician." I stood in the corridor of the Clínica Universidad de Navarra in Pamplona, with the sealed envelope against my chest, inside my jacket. I thought of Carlo's words from 2006. There will be someone there who needs you to have read it. I excused myself for 3 minutes. I went to a bathroom at the end of the corridor. I locked the door. I took the envelope out of my jacket. My hands were not shaking. They were steady in the particular way hands become steady when you realize the situation demands it. I broke the seal. The paper inside was a single sheet, folded twice. The handwriting was Carlo's. I recognized it from the notes in his hospital chart. It was dated October 6th, 2006, the day he had pressed it into my hands. It read in Italian, which I translate here as precisely as I can. "Dr. Santelli, I know you are not a man who accepts things without evidence, so I am giving you evidence in advance. When you are finally in Pamplona, you will be at the Clínica Universidad de Navarra. There will be a boy with a heart problem who needs someone to look carefully at the inflammation picture before treating the rhythm. Look at the inflammatory markers first. His name begins with M. His mother prays. She will know who I am. The date on this letter is your proof that I knew before you did. Take care of him. Carlo." I read it 3 times. A boy with a heart problem. A mother who prays to Carlo Acutis. Pamplona. The Clínica Universidad de Navarra. Look at the inflammatory markers before treating the rhythm. I looked at the date on the letter. October 6th, 2006. 13 years, for months, and 11 days before I was standing in that corridor. I folded the letter. I put it back in my jacket pocket. I walked back down the corridor to where Dr. Ituri was waiting. "Tell me the patient's first name." I said. "Miguel," she said. "M." I went into the consultation room. The case file was open on the table. The presenting picture was a cardiac arrhythmia, an atrial rhythm irregularity that the local team had been preparing to address with an antiarrhythmic protocol. I asked to see the full inflammatory panel before we discussed the cardiac treatment. Dr. Ituri gave me a measured look and then pulled up the lab results. C-reactive protein, 47.3 milligrams per liter. Reference range, under 5. Erythrocyte sedimentation rate, 68 millimeters per hour. Interleukin, 6, 22.4 picograms per milliliter. The picture was unambiguous. There was an active systemic inflammatory process that had not been fully evaluated before the arrhythmia treatment was being planned. In a 9-year-old boy with an active inflammatory picture at these levels, initiating certain antiarrhythmic protocols carries a risk of exacerbating myocarditis, an inflammation of the cardiac muscle that could convert an arrhythmia case into a significantly more dangerous one. I told Dr. Ituri we needed to investigate the inflammatory source before treating the rhythm. She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. The subsequent investigation found a viral myocarditis, Coxsackie B3, confirmed by PCR on February 19, 2020. The arrhythmia was a symptom of the cardiac inflammation, not a primary electrical disorder. The treatment protocol was restructured entirely: anti-inflammatory management first, cardiac monitoring, and the arrhythmia resolved as the myocarditis was treated. Miguel was discharged on February 28th. He was fine. I met his mother on February 21st. She was a small woman, very still, with the quality I have come to associate with people who have prayed through something rather than simply enduring it. I told her that Miguel's treatment was going well and that the team had identified the underlying cause. She thanked me, and then she said, "Did you know Carlo Acutis personally?" I looked at her for a moment. "Yes," I said. "I was his doctor." She pressed her hands together and closed her eyes. I took the letter out of my jacket pocket and I showed it to her. I showed her the date. I told her, in summary, what it said. She did not say anything for a long time. When she finally spoke, she said, "He told us to look for the traces." I drove back to my hotel that evening along the Pamplona streets, and I felt something I do not have a clinical name for. Not relief exactly. Something more structural than relief. As though a question that had been weight-bearing for 13 years had been answered, and the structure it had been holding up could now rest on something solid. I called Pietro Vasari from my room. I told him what had happened. He was quiet on the phone for almost 30 seconds. Then he said, "Santilli, we have to testify." I knew he was right. I gave formal testimony to the Diocesan Investigation Commission in Rome in September 2020, for weeks before the beatification. I submitted the letter, the original, dated October 6, 2006, along with a sworn statement documenting the full timeline. The October 6th handover, the sealed condition of the envelope over 13 years, the instructions Carlo gave me, the specific correspondences between the letter's content and the clinical situation in Pamplona on February 17, 2020. Pietro Vasari submitted his own testimony independently, including the original email from October 12, 2006, with its verifiable timestamp. Father Casali had submitted his written diocesan account in late 2006, and a copy of that document was already in the canonical file. 3 independent testimonies. 3 independent pieces of documented evidence. No single one of us knew the full picture of what the others had experienced when we each first encountered Carlo Acutis. The beatification took place on October 10, 2020, in Assisi. I was not in Assisi that day. I was in Monza, on duty, watching a live stream during a break between shifts. But I want to tell you what I remember about those minutes. I was in the break room of the same hospital where Carlo had died 14 years earlier. I was sitting in the same chair I had sat in on the morning of October 3, 2006, when the call came through about the new pediatric admission. The screen in front of me showed the piazza in Assisi, the facade of the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, and Pope Francis speaking the words of beatification over an image of a 15-year-old boy in a dark hoodie, the boy I had watched die in room 14, the boy whose face, 2 minutes after clinical death, had expressed something that my 31 years of medicine could not name. Blessed Carlo Acutis. I sat there for a moment after the live stream ended, in the break room, in the quiet, and I thought about the expression on his face on October 12, 2006. The recognition, the arrival. I think I know now what he was looking at. On September 7, 2025, Carlo Acutis was canonized by Pope Leo XIV in Rome during the Jubilee year. The canonization incorporated the second documented miracle, the healing of Valeria Valverde, a Costa Rican woman who had suffered severe traumatic brain injury in 2022 and recovered in a manner the medical commission, after reviewing the complete clinical record, determined to be without natural explanation. The commission's documentation ran to 237 pages. The first millennial saint. That is what the world calls him now. I attended the canonization on September 7th, 2025. I sat in St. Peter's Square. I was not in the press section, not in any official capacity. I sat in the General Assembly, in the ordinary crowd, in the September morning. I had Pietro's email in my jacket pocket, a printed copy, and I had a photograph that Antonia Salzano had given me years earlier of Carlo sitting in exactly that position I had seen him in on October 3, 2006, upright in a hospital bed, reading with that specific expression. When Pope Leo XIV pronounced the canonization, Sanctum esse decernimus et definimus, I felt something move through the crowd that I have observed before in large human gatherings, and that I cannot characterize any further except to say it was real, and it was collective, and it was not manufactured by the moment alone. 50,000 people. One sound. I thought about a 15-year-old boy who had told a dying of leukemia story with the calm of someone who had already read the final page. He had said, "The Eucharist is my highway to heaven. I'm not worried about the destination." He was not worried. I have been a physician for 31 years. I have sat with hundreds of people in the last hours of their lives. I have held hands in the dark with families at the border of the one experience none of us can document from the inside. And I can tell you that fear of the destination is the most consistent thing I have encountered in those rooms. It is almost universal. It is biological, it is understandable, it is human. Carlo Acutis was not afraid. And now, having watched the arc of what he left behind, the website still running, the exhibition traveling the world, 2 verified miracles recognized by the Church, the Pamplona letter dated October 6, 2006, Pietro's email from October 12, 2006, Father Casali's diocesan account from November 2006, the temperature readings documented by Nurse Manetti, the expression that my vocabulary failed to describe. Having lived inside this evidence for 19 years, I find I am also less afraid. Not without questions. I still have questions. Any honest physician should. But the particular fear, the fear that what we see is all there is, that the door closes and nothing waits beyond it, that specific fear is gone. I keep my personal notes from October 2006 in a folder in my desk drawer. 7 paragraphs, time-stamped, describing in clinical language what I saw on Carlo Acutis' face at 11:18 a.m. on October 12, 2006. I have read them many times. The language is precise and neutral. It was written by a man who believed deeply in precision and neutrality. But the thing it describes is not neutral. It was never neutral. I just did not have the vocabulary for it then. I have the vocabulary now. The expression was recognition. The expression was arrival. The expression was exactly what Father Casali told me it would be. Real, not residual, not a reflex, not a muscular artifact of a body in transition. What I saw on Carlo Acutis' face in the 2 minutes after his heart stopped was a person reaching a destination they had always known was there. And I was privileged. I use that word clinically and personally. I was privileged to have been in the room. That is what I saw. That is what I have carried for 19 years. And that is why, when people ask me whether I believe in God now, I answer the same way I answer any clinical question. I follow the data. The data says yes. There is one more thing. In May 2023, I was invited to give a presentation at a conference on the intersection of medicine and the beatification processes of the Catholic Church, held in Rome. I gave a 40-minute talk. I described the temperature anomalies, the documentation timeline, the Pamplona letter. Afterward, a young doctor, a resident in internal medicine from Barcelona, maybe 26 years old, came up to me and said, "Dr. Santelli, I grew up knowing about Carlo Acutis because of the Eucharistic Miracles website. I went to one of his exhibitions when I was 12. It was the first time I thought seriously about faith." She was 12 in approximately 2009. She had seen an exhibition assembled by a boy who was already dead. That is what Carlo Acutis built. A catalog, a trail of evidence, a body of documentation that said, here is what was found. Make of it what you will. He called it traces. The traces of heaven, he wrote in one of the notes on his website. I had found the phrase while reading through the site in February 2007, and it had stayed with me. The traces of heaven are everywhere. You only have to know how to look. I am looking. I have been looking since October 12, 2006, when a 15-year-old boy died in room 14 of the San Gerardo Hospital in Monza, with an expression on his face that I could not explain, and that I have spent 19 years understanding. I think I understand it now, and I hope I genuinely hope, with whatever the clinical equivalent of hope is, that you will look to. If this testimony has marked you the way it has marked my life, and I say that not as a phrase, but as the accurate description of what 19 years of living with this evidence has done to me, then I ask you one thing. Subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Not because we need the numbers, but because Carlo's mission was documentation and distribution, making sure that people who need the evidence find it. That is what we do here. On this channel, we keep gathering the traces Carlo left all over the world, story by story, witness by witness. And if you want to carry something of this story with you when the video ends, the free novena to Carlo Acutis is in the description. The first link right below this video. 9 days of prayer. Pray it for someone you love. Share it with someone who is afraid of a destination. Keep his memory alive. Carlo said the Eucharist was his highway to heaven. The traces of heaven are everywhere. You only have to know how to look.